Picture this. You are 8 years old, torn from your family as arms, and delivered to the glittering court of Queen Isabella of France in 1308. Your small hands shake as ornate palace doors swing open, revealing marble corridors that stretch like golden tunnels toward your uncertain fate. You clutch a small wooden toy, the last remnant of home, while silk-clad courtiers whisper behind jeweled fans about the fresh batch of noble children arriving for their education. But this isn't the fairy tale upbringing you were promised. This is something far more sinister, something that will haunt European nobility for centuries to come. The Queen's cold blue eyes assess you like livestock at market. Your value isn't measured in love or potential, but in political leverage, family connections, and how easily your will can be broken to serve the crown's purposes. Welcome to the medieval system of royal wardship, where children became pawns in games they couldn't understand, and where the most powerful women in Europe wielded cruelty as precisely as any sword. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. This is the systematic destruction of childhood innocence by the very women who are supposed to protect it. The queens, duchesses, and noble ladies who transformed royal courts into laboratories of psychological torture, where young minds were molded through fear, isolation, and punishments so creative they would make professional torturers weep with envy. The medieval system of wardship began as a feudal obligation, but it quickly evolved into something far more predatory. When noble families fell into debt, faced political disgrace, or simply needed to curry favor with the crown, they would surrender their children as collateral. These boys and girls, some as young as 5, would be placed under the guardianship of royal households, where they would supposedly receive education, training, and preparation for adult responsibilities. But the reality was horrifyingly different. Royal wards weren't students. They were prisoners with better clothes. They weren't being educated. They were being systematically broken down and rebuilt according to their guardians' twisted specifications. And the women who oversaw these programs weren't maternal figures. They were architects of suffering who understood that controlling a child's formative years meant controlling their entire future. Queen Isabel of Bavaria, wife of the mad King Charles VI of France, perfected this system in ways that would make modern child psychologists recoil in horror. Her court became infamous throughout Europe for the creative punishments she devised for the noble children under her care. But Isabel wasn't unique. She was simply the most documented example of a phenomenon that plagued medieval courts across the continent. These royal women understood something that modern people often forget. Childhood trauma doesn't just damage the individual child. It creates adults who are easier to manipulate, more desperate for approval, and completely dependent on the very system that destroyed their innocence. The queens weren't just punishing misbehaving children. They were engineering future generations of nobles who would be psychologically incapable of challenging royal authority. The punishments began subtly, designed to appear reasonable to outside observers, while slowly eroding the child's sense of security and self-worth. A ward who spoke out of turn might be denied meals for a day, told it was for their own good, to teach them proper respect. A girl who showed too much independence might find her personal belongings mysteriously disappearing, only to be returned when she demonstrated appropriate submission. But these minor cruelties were just the beginning. The real psychological warfare began once the children had been softened by months of uncertainty and intermittent punishment. That's when the royal ladies would implement their more sophisticated tortures, carefully calibrated to break spirits without leaving physical evidence that might scandalize other noble families. Queen Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI of England, developed what her courtiers euphemistically called the silence treatment. Wards who displeased her would be completely ignored by every adult in the household, for days or even weeks at a time. Servants would bring food, but wouldn't make eye contact. Tutors would teach lessons to empty air, while the invisible child sat desperately trying to earn acknowledgement. Other wards were forbidden from speaking to the punished child, creating complete social isolation in an environment where peer relationships were the only source of comfort. Imagine being 10 years old and suddenly becoming a ghost in your own life. Every desperate attempt to regain attention only confirmed your worthlessness in the eyes of the adults who controlled your world. The psychological damage was profound and permanent. Children subjected to this treatment often developed severe anxiety disorders, an obsessive need for approval, and a pathological fear of abandonment that would plague them throughout their adult lives. The French court under Queen Isabel took these psychological tortures to even more sophisticated levels. She instituted what she called loyalty tests, elaborate scenarios designed to pit the wards against each other while revealing their deepest fears and insecurities. A child might be told in confidence that another ward had spoken ill of them, and be watched to see how they responded. Those who sought revenge were punished for cruelty. Those who remained passive were punished for weakness. These weren't random acts of sadism. They were carefully orchestrated campaigns of psychological manipulation designed to identify each child, breaking point, and then exploit it mercilessly. A ward who showed pride in their family lineage might be forced to recite daily confessions of their ancestors' failures and sins. A child who demonstrated artistic talent might have their drawings publicly mocked and destroyed, told they were presumptuous for thinking they possessed any gifts worth sharing. The physical punishments were equally creative and psychologically devastating. Unlike the crude beatings administered to peasant children, royal wards experienced tortures that were designed to humiliate as much as they hurt. Queen Isabel's favorite punishment involved forcing misbehaving children to wear animal costumes during formal court functions. A boy who had shown cowardice might be dressed as a rabbit and forced to hop through the great hall while courtiers laughed and pointed. A girl who had displayed vanity might be costumed as a pig and made to root through scraps on the floor while elegant ladies discussed her shame in loud whispers. These humiliations served multiple purposes. They entertained the adult courtiers, demonstrated the queen's absolute power over the children, and created lasting psychological scars that would ensure the wards never forgot their place in the hierarchy. But perhaps most insidiously, they forced the other children to witness the degradation of their peers, creating a climate of terror where everyone understood that resistance was not only futile, but would result in public shame that could never be lived down. The sleeping arrangements in royal households were designed to maximize psychological pressure while maintaining the appearance of proper care. Wards were housed in dormitories where privacy was impossible, and every interaction was monitored by adult supervisors. But these weren't protective environments. They were psychological pressure cookers where children were encouraged to spy on each other and report infractions in exchange for minor privileges. A child who reported another ward's nighttime crying might be rewarded with an extra blanket or a piece of fruit. Those who kept silent about their peers' struggles would find themselves subjected to increased scrutiny and punishment. The system created an atmosphere of constant betrayal, where genuine friendships were impossible and trust became a luxury that no one could afford. The educational component of wardship was equally corrupted by these power dynamics. Lessons weren't designed to develop the children's minds or prepare them for future responsibilities. They were vehicles for further psychological manipulation. A history lesson might focus exclusively on examples of nobles who had been executed for defying royal authority. Literature classes emphasized stories of children who had been rewarded for absolute obedience to their superiors. Even religious instruction was twisted to support the message that questioning authority was equivalent to challenging God himself. The queens and their female courtiers took particular pleasure in corrupting the natural bonds between siblings who had been placed in wardship together. Brothers and sisters were often housed separately and encouraged to compete for adult approval through increasingly desperate displays of loyalty to their guardians. A sister might be rewarded for reporting her brother's homesickness. A brother might earn privileges by publicly criticizing his sister's behavior. These tactics systematically destroyed the family bonds that might have provided emotional support and resistance to the system. Children learned that their survival depended on complete allegiance to their royal guardians, even if it meant betraying the people they had once loved most. The psychological damage was multi-generational, as these broken adults would go on to perpetuate similar patterns with their own children, having never learned what healthy family relationships looked like. The medical treatments administered to royal wards revealed another layer of systematic cruelty disguised as care. Palace physicians, operating under direct orders from their royal mistresses, developed treatments that were designed to weaken children both physically and psychologically while maintaining plausible medical justification. Queen Isabel's court physician, Master Guillaume de Chauliac, kept detailed records of his treatments that survive to this day, revealing a horrifying pattern of deliberate harm masked as healing. Children who showed signs of rebellion or independence were diagnosed with an excess of choleric humors, requiring immediate bloodletting to restore balance. But these weren't the careful, measured procedures used on adult nobles. Ward children were bled to the point of weakness, leaving them dizzy, pale, and unable to muster the energy for resistance. The treatments were scheduled strategically, often right before important lessons or court appearances, ensuring the children would be too weak to perform well and could be punished for their failures. Purging was another favorite medical torture, administered through a combination of herbs that would cause violent intestinal distress lasting for days. Children who had been caught whispering together after lights out might find themselves subjected to these treatments, forcing them to soil themselves repeatedly while courtiers wrinkled their noses in disgust. The shame was overwhelming, but the isolation was worse. No child wanted to be near someone who might contaminate them with whatever sickness was causing such humiliating symptoms. The queens developed elaborate systems of privileges that could be granted or revoked based on the children's behavior. But these privileges were designed to create dependence rather than motivation. A ward who pleased their guardians might be allowed to write a letter home, but the contents were carefully monitored and often edited to remove any hint of distress. Parents received cheerful notes describing wonderful educational opportunities while their children wept themselves to sleep, just meters away from the scribes who had helped craft these lies. Food became another weapon in the arsenal of psychological warfare. Meals were presented as acts of generosity from benevolent guardians, but portion sizes and quality varied dramatically based on the child's recent behavior. A ward who had excelled in their lessons might receive meat and fresh bread, while those who had displeased their supervisors were given thin gruel and stale crusts. The message was clear. Even basic survival was a gift that could be withdrawn at any moment. But perhaps more insidious was the way food was used to corrupt relationships between the children. Special treats might be given to one child in full view of their hungry peers, with instructions to eat slowly and savor every bite. The recipient faced an impossible choice: refuse the food and face punishment for ingratitude, or accept it and endure the hatred of starving friends. These scenarios were carefully orchestrated to ensure that every moment of pleasure came with a corresponding dose of guilt and social isolation. The seasonal cycles of court life provided natural opportunities for intensifying the psychological pressure on royal wards. The seasonal cycles of court life provided natural opportunities for intensifying the psychological pressure on royal wards. A boy might be dressed as a fool and required to tell jokes that mocked his own family as political failures. A girl might be made to dance while courtiers commented loudly on her clumsiness and lack of grace. These performances served multiple purposes beyond mere entertainment. They demonstrated to visiting nobles that their hosts had complete control over the children in their care. They provided opportunities for the queens to display their creativity in devising new forms of humiliation. And most importantly, they created lasting memories of shame that would haunt the children for the rest of their lives, ensuring they would never forget the price of resistance. The Easter season brought its own unique tortures, as religious observances were corrupted into vehicles for psychological manipulation. Children were required to confess their sins publicly, but the confessions were carefully coached to include admissions of ingratitude toward their royal guardians. A ward might be forced to stand before the assembled court and tearfully admit to harboring rebellious thoughts or failing to appreciate the wonderful opportunities they had been given. These public confessions served to reinforce the message that any unhappiness or resistance was a moral failing on the child's part, rather than a natural response to abuse. The religious framework provided perfect cover for the psychological manipulation, as questioning the system could be framed as questioning God's divine plan for their lives. The queens took particular pleasure in corrupting the children's memories of home and family. New arrivals would be encouraged to share stories about their previous lives, but these innocent reminiscences would be twisted into evidence of their family's failures and inadequacies. A child who spoke fondly of their mother's cooking might be told that such simple pleasures were beneath their new station. Those who mentioned missing their pets or favorite toys were mocked for their childish attachments to worthless objects. Over time, the children learned to edit their memories, suppressing recollections that might be used against them, and gradually replacing them with the approved narratives provided by their guardians. The psychological colonization was so complete that many wards genuinely came to believe that their previous lives had been inferior, and that their current suffering was actually a form of salvation. The correspondence between royal courts reveals how these techniques were shared and refined across national boundaries. Queen Philippa of Hainault, wife of Edward III of England, maintained regular communication with her continental counterparts, exchanging detailed accounts of successful punishment strategies and comparing notes on which methods produced the most lasting psychological damage. These letters read like technical manuals for child abuse, written in the flowery language of courtly correspondence, but containing brutally practical advice on breaking young spirits. The marriage arrangements made for former royal wards provide perhaps the clearest evidence of the long-term success of these psychological conditioning programs. Children who had been raised in royal households showed remarkably consistent patterns in their adult relationships: an obsessive need for approval from authority figures, an inability to form genuine intimate bonds with peers, and a tendency to recreate the same patterns of psychological manipulation with their own children. These weren't accidental outcomes. They were the intended results of a carefully designed system that transformed potential rivals into loyal servants who would spend their entire lives seeking the approval they had been denied as children. The queens understood that a nobleman who had been properly conditioned in childhood would never pose a genuine threat to royal authority, no matter how much political power he might eventually accumulate. The few children who managed to resist this conditioning often paid a terrible price. Records from the court of Queen Joan of Navarre describe the fate of young Lord Edmund de Grey, who maintained his defiant spirit despite years of escalating punishments. His final recorded appearance in court documents describes him as being sent to serve as a page in the household of a particularly brutal lord on the Scottish border, effectively a death sentence disguised as a career opportunity. But Edmund's story also reveals the limits of even the most sophisticated psychological torture. Some spirits simply refused to break, no matter how much pressure was applied. These exceptional children often found ways to maintain their sanity through secret acts of resistance, hidden journals, coded messages to siblings, or small rituals that preserved their sense of individual identity despite overwhelming pressure to conform. The legacy of medieval royal wardship extended far beyond the immediate suffering of the children involved. The psychological techniques developed in these royal households would be refined and passed down through generations, eventually forming the foundation for educational and child-rearing practices that persisted well into the modern era. The belief that children needed to be broken before they could be properly molded remained a cornerstone of aristocratic child-rearing for centuries after the medieval period ended. The medieval system of royal wardship represents one of history's most systematic examples of institutional child abuse, disguised as education and wrapped in the silken trappings of privilege. These weren't isolated cases of cruelty by individual monsters, but carefully orchestrated programs designed to psychologically enslave entire generations of nobility before they could develop the strength to resist. The queens and noble ladies who perfected these techniques understood something that modern child psychologists have only recently begun to fully appreciate: that trauma inflicted during childhood doesn't just wound the individual victim, it reshapes their entire understanding of power, relationships, and their place in the world. By controlling the formative experiences of noble children, these royal women were engineering the future of European aristocracy itself. Perhaps most chilling is how these practices were normalized, even celebrated, as evidence of the royal court's civilizing influence on rough provincial children. The very families who surrendered their sons and daughters to these systems genuinely believed they were providing opportunities for advancement, never suspecting that they were delivering their children into the hands of sophisticated psychological predators. The stories of these forgotten victims remind us that power corrupts most completely when it operates in darkness, protected by social respectability and institutional authority. Behind the glittering facades of medieval courts, children suffered in ways that would shock us today, their pain hidden by the very privilege that was supposed to protect them. Their voices, silenced by fear and shame, echo across the centuries as a warning about what happens when those entrusted with protecting the vulnerable choose instead to exploit them.